or maybe a beginning. So that work is, I think of and call a book length poem. And I'm going to read just a little bit from that so that people can have an opportunity to hear what's going on. But I kind of want to spend most of my time talking about the ways in which that work was really more of an opportunity to move that thinking in a number of different directions, and to sort of as a jumping off place for getting to a place where I have not yet gotten, in a kind of in a hopeful movement towards a kind of feminist theorization that I am in the middle of and can't really say what the end point of is yet. But what I'll do is I'll read a little bit from the poems. I'll say a little bit about the progress since the poems, and then I'll read a tiny, tiny bit of critical work that is really being drafted like at this moment, that's sort of part of the flowering of the work, and that will be it for me. So I'm going to start just by reading a couple of poems from Or on Being the Other Woman. I'm going to read from my phone so that I don't have to look at other things from the screen. Just a second. All the young people read from their phones, but I'm not really young, so I have an excuse. Okay, this has an epigraph from a song called Mistress, which is a song by a rapper named who's called Gunna. Gunna actually happens to be incarcerated in Atlanta, in Fulton County right now, as a part of this very complex RICO prosecution that him and a score of other defendants have been swept up in a state RICO prosecution that include Gunna and Young Thug. It's very complicated, and I actually hope to write about it soon, but I'm not there yet. But anyway, the line from the song is, "Got me a real mistress, and she's independent." I have become misaligned or crooked with respect to the field of dependency, basically a free radical. If I keep looking at the word independent, I can see it surrounded by practices of sex work. It is always pussy that gives me value, and this fact of undeniable facticity must also enter my estimation of the state of my own excess. The forms my life takes have berserk intensity, dissolute facticity. Whatever means I use to accomplish liberation will lead inevitably to the destruction of someone's marriage. That's true. You rail against men, my lover writes to me. We use an encrypted form of digital messaging as if anyone cares what we say to one another. Certainly, I do not believe that anyone does, but these are his wishes. Men, as they exist in their bodies, are not the subject of my interest, so I do not rail against them. That is a misrepresentation of the whole of my aesthetic and phenomenological project, which involves taking up the vision I have been given of my own freedom. I have been given a vision of it, life beyond use. The white women who own the fancy nail salon I go to fired the manager I loved, a Black woman photographer who treated me with professional respect for my time, my lack of it. She knew my work and the work of my sister. She let me use my paid-for seat as a place to weep behind the screen of her conversation, using herself as a blessed covering for me. I realized those bitches don't want me in here. I understood I had witnessed an act of aggression against our presence, our desire to be adorned, to have comforts, to cultivate the rot of this corruptible, all its deathy glory. The nigger woman is the mistress of the world. Optimal dependency being a flowering of sexual and other forms of competition. I don't think of the book as like so full of rage, but then I read the poems and I'm like, the book is full of rage. So we'll see what you think. Okay, this is not titled, it's just a section from later on in the book. No man has ever not tried to steal from me. That's wrong. The man who never tried to steal from me never wanted to be with me like that. While the man I was with who explicitly stole from me was so crazy at the time, I didn't think much of it structurally, or I could not think structurally at the time. In California, Prairie Light and scenes from Midwinter Day were coming to me in a confusing way via social media. I wrote to Laura, I had a dream in which I was overcome or beset by a kind of erotic storm, encircled by lovers, that is, men, of whom I would say, fucking is eternally in the nature of our bond, the transmutational properties of masculinity, the three, forcefully whipping around me, having become a cosmos of presence to myself, my mimesis with no share of the bearing down. Inside their fucking gyre, I transmitted a signal for help, but it could not escape because the force of the dimensions which they were or were creating was a black hole. The real blackness of the hole was true. I woke up knowing what words to say. Say the dream, Laura. Within 2 or 3 days, I had been trying to identify the name of the pressures. No, I cannot remember what any of them had done to me. I try to remember forming an intention. Now I am going to act as crazy as possible and threaten to go to his job and tell his mama and his best friend what kind of person he is and how he's been stealing from me all these years and telling people I'm a spoiled bitch because I have all these degrees and won't take my baby out of private preschool. So I was acting crazy and smoking out the window of my house, screaming into the garden at the mourning doves, looking at me like I was crazy. I stopped when he said a number, I guess. I can't remember much about it because I got pretty drunk afterward and woke up in the night thinking, Lord, I am not able to do this much longer. Please let this man see my humanity. In 2 or 3 days also, I had learned there was no name for the pressures. It was the most ordinary Black womanhood, which is not nameless, has all the names of us, and is nameless, and has no intention, and is strategic. One of the days, a young dancer came up to me and said, I don't know how to embody the musical problems. And I said, well, how does it make you feel? I began to speak of it myself when I felt myself growing more graphically male through its practice. I listen at deafening loudness in my car. Clearly, I am trying to hurt myself. The words, they say, they have a newness. I promise never to speak the words in my poems, not in defiance of interpretation, but because they are so creepily hostile and unfunny. The interior they assume in a dress so murderous, I don't see the point of repeating them. This is what words do. How does it make you feel? You are not allowed to have feelings. You are not allowed to have anything. And when you have something, somebody will try to take it from you. Don't doubt it for a second. There is no honor in patriarchy. It is a drug. Sometimes I allow my eyes to roll back in its vicious pleasure. I can feel joy if I remember I am feeling the power of myself as a vacuous thing, an unknown thing, out of which words come under pressure, beginning to make new, so that the structure of the poem was falling down around me, as were the constitutive energies of what I was, such as they were visible or detectable to me. I sensed them breaking. They were already broken. This was the condition of which the poem must consist. The radiant materiality of circuitous attacks, some such as might be deflected, others helplessly slip inside what is. So that poem is, it's about like a 75 or so page poem, so-called. And it consists of some prose sections and some sections that look more like verse, some sort of meditation specifically on the rap music that I sort of became focused on at the end of writing my last book, that is Dear Angel of Death, which I finished around 2018 with a kind of question about whether trap music held any sort of teachings for us about this sort of contemporary condition of not only Black art, but also Black studies, whether some of the sort of retentions and important insights of 20th century Black studies had not in some way begun to be displaced or challenged by what was actually happening in rap music today. And I got really obsessed with it, and I immersed myself in listening to this music, which I actually would have been listening to anyway. It wasn't a stretch or, you know, a sort of step or a leap outside what I would normally have been doing. I listened to rap music and have listened to rap music since I was a teenager, and I'm 50 now, so we sort of grew up together. We are exactly the same age. And but you know, I have my moments where I didn't listen so much. I'm kind of a music nerd. I listen to a lot of different things, but I got very, very, very interested in particular in Future at one point. And I got very, very interested in Chief Keef and began to sort of focus in on those two artists and think about how poetically I could think about composing theory or criticism that was not literary criticism and wasn't focused on the lyrical content so much, which in some ways was not really what was happening in the music. But I needed to find ways to sort of speak through my interest, which had kind of already been done in Or on Being the Other Woman, just identifying what the interest was and what the emotional tensions or paradoxes were in the sort of, you know, apparent misogyny and violence that the music sort of rehearses, and the sort of absolute pleasures that it then dispenses to not just me, but like billions of other people. And so that emotional paradox, which is like in some ways like not that new or interesting, and has been, you know, part of the conversation that Saidiya Hartman and others have been having about this sort of combination of pleasure and pain that is part of the nature of Black so-called subjectivity. But I got really interested in it as maybe like not an aspect of subjectivity or something like that, but rather a signal about what others call Blackness itself. That is, that there was something very true and very real about the representation or expression that was happening in that music that had something to say to me about the social conditions in which especially Black femininity was being asked to go into the world. And so I started thinking not only about how to bring the sound aspect of what I was thinking about forward. So that required me to think through how performance was going to come into the project. And that has ended up being like incredibly fruitful for me and kind of mind-blowing, all the various ways in which collaboration and sounds and movement can kind of come into the space of the work I do, which is poetry. It's primarily poetry. And of course, then, you know, the critical work that always is going alongside the sort of, you know, language art of writing poetry. You know, it's just been really hard trying to articulate some of these issues. And I guess what I'm going to do, like, finally, is just read a little bit, just a tiny sample of the kinds of conclusions that I've sort of been pushing towards as I, you know, finished On Being the Other Woman, or On Being the Other Woman. The last poems were written in late 2020 or maybe early 2021. And the critical writing really began in 2021. So it's like not stopped. And in some ways it's disturbing because I sort of wish the music would leave me alone or let me go or something, but it has not. And it's only now that the critical writing, I think, is coming to an end as I've sort of made this 75 or so page manuscript, this essay, which I think, you know, yeah, it says the things that I've been thinking about. So here's a little taste of that. I'm not even gonna explain it. I'm just gonna read a little bit. This is like page 69. So I want to experimentally suspend my ongoing paranoid argument with myself regarding the question of whether the Black radical tradition has embedded within it a historically contingent politics of desegregation, which has been displaced, in order to grant that desegregation may figuratively or imagely cover not only the project of dismantling Jim Crow, but a wide range of abolitionist adventures, back to the first one, also towards some forms of Black living that can only be understood as willing entanglement with the violent stuff of which Blackness is made, not rejection of our lot. That is, grant the transmutable figure of desegregation, its aura and gases, creates or releases conditions for imagining Blackness in a highly complex and ambivalent relation with itself as it's become, that is far less happy than is comfortable to admit. Indeed, I'm fascinated by the possibility of severing from improvement the nasty side of the double edge that is the core of Hartman's insights regarding Black subjectivity. I want to deal with the hard, bad space of living that is symbolically, but not actually, severed by the blade that would cut any reconstituted future. Let's think about the radiation of eternal denial, frustration, and threat in and as community. Returning to McKittrick and Wehelier, that is Alexander Wehelier and Catherine McKittrick's great essay, 808s and Heartbreak. Shivering circuits of pleasure laced with damage, sorrow, and loss, that's them. I'm led to ask what happens to the heart when no relief or support, what I think is meant by social life, is available, ever? What if infinite heartbreak, dumb and excruciating pain that has no implied political or moral correlate, precisely because it is unintelligible within a framework that anticipates the cessation of Black despair upon the eradication of the racial subjugation or social alienation that is its cause, is in a blind spot of the Black radical tradition, unseen by it? What must be done with the one who finds the truth of her living is here, who chooses this unintelligible Blackness? And I'll just stop there.
Simone, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. I just especially appreciate the ways you're talking about Black musical aesthetics and how they index contemporary conditions of the social and performance and sound in your poetry. It's really wonderful to hear from you. Sophie, I'll bring you up so we can hear from you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Simone, for doing this with me. That was beautiful. I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes on my previous book, the one before this one, as a way of introducing you to it. So it was called Full Surrogacy Now, not because it was interested in so-called third-party pregnancy arrangements as they are currently thought of, but rather because I precisely wanted to question the naturalized differences between so-called surrogacy pregnancies and so-called non-surrogacy or normal pregnancies, and to link that naturalization to capitalism, specifically its private property regime. I was speculating that the meaning of the word surrogacy couldn't really survive in a world where private property had been abolished. in academia, I noticed criticisms of the commercial gestational surrogacy industry, which are, very easy and necessary to make, and they are criticisms I often don't dispute, right? Indeed, I think I deepen them in some ways in this book. But the standard criticisms were not asking the question, compared to what? They were abandoning all criticality vis-a-vis quote unquote normal baby making. So I wanted to link the rich history of radical critique of the private household, usually the private nuclear household, that is to say the family, as a gestational workplace, with this kind of newly exceptionalized and high profile politics of procreative assistance. One of the thoughts I had earliest in this process was the thought, all reproduction is assisted, surely, although assistance can come in quite utopian and dystopian ways. I sort of described the deeply dystopian sense in which our social reproduction under capitalism has been built on surrogacy. So, Angela Davis was quick to point out in the 80s, when newspapers wanted to talk about the quote unquote new reproductive technologies, that they were anything but new in terms of their underlying relations of race and gendered class. Captive mothers on slave plantations were automatically surrogates, she said, because Blackness in the North American settler colonies was cast outside of the symbolic order of gendered humanness, and therefore outside of proprietarian parentality. And this is why some voices within Black philosophy, many of them already mentioned by Simone, and indeed Simone herself, have referred to the phrase the Black family as an oxymoron, not because the family should be a measuring stick to people's care for one another, but because the family as a sanctioned circle of authorized privacy into which the state is not permitted to tread simply has not existed in Black communities, generally speaking, in this country. Its boundaries can always be violated by the state with impunity. So that's basically the contours of the dystopian sense of surrogacy. Care has been systematically privatized and surrogated on a global scale, including via immigrant economies of care labor, which is what some theorists have called reproductive stratification, or the new reproductive division of labor. But as mentioned, or as you may know, or as you may have intuited, I was also interested in a critically utopian valence of the phrase full surrogacy now, where the phrase operates in a prescriptive rather than a descriptive sense. And by that, I basically meant abolish the family. If we one day had managed to build a world in which children are not conceptualized as possessions, not conceptualized as extensions of the self, a world in which we have learned not just to be the makers of one another, but also to organize our lives as though that were true. Not just to be the makers of one another, but to act like it as classless equals and comradely strangers, then there would be no surrogacy. Or alternatively, one might say, there would be nothing but surrogacy. There'd be a lot more surrogacy. Instead of labors being outsourced by their proper owner, there would be something like a baseline of copyleft, anti-proprietary, mutual care labors with no private source of legal authorization, such as the present exclusive institutions of motherhood or fatherhood. Okay, so the new book is very short, sort of pamphlet length, and it is more accessibly written. So it is also, as you heard, about the communization of care, but it came out of a PhD the previous book came out of a PhD in academic human geography, whereas this book comes from a sort of a new phase of my creativity, which is sort of a para-academic writer existence. So this manifesto, sprang from a lot of requests for clarification of the family abolitionist component in full surrogacy now. So Abolish the Family seeks to make a persuasive argument for the positive supersession of the private household. It defines the family as the form that care privatization takes in a class society. It proceeds in 4 steps. First, addressing the psychic pain and distress that many people, in fact, probably almost all of us, experience in the face of the phrase family abolition, even if we have heard of the phrase, which many of us, despite the phrase's fairly significant history, have not, right? Secondly, it answers head on the, to my mind, most valid and important line of objection to the politics of family abolitionism, namely the demand that non-white households and non-Western, working class, migrant, queer and/or indigenous households should be excluded from the definition of the family in play. And thirdly, it provides a whistle-stop overview of the groups, movements, and individuals who have for over 2 centuries theorized and dreamed about abolishing the family. And there's also a kind of conclusion that argues that our metaphors around kinship could perhaps be generatively changed up, and sort of questioning the usefulness of kin as the container for all of our most sort of pressing intimacies and desires. As Tiffany Latagbo King says, there are other ways of naming each other as relations. Perhaps we could experiment more energetically with those. But yeah, the history includes a strand that operated, so to speak, within the house of the family, and a strand that operated sort of without, from the outside. So on the one hand, I look at utopian feminists, gay liberationists, sort of anti-work communist housewives, and children's liberationists who wanted to explode the private-public distinction at the heart of patriarchy and capitalism and build instead cities for friends, cities without private kitchens, cities full of infrastructures of common nurturance. And then on the other hand, I looked at a history of fugitive, colonized, sterilized, sexually persecuted, criminalized, incarcerated, welfare dependent, and maroon communities, notably in examples I look at in the United States, who sought to destroy via resistance and evasion the systems of settler sexuality, capitalist familism, and proprietarian householding imposed on them by the state, right? As I say, the last step looks at the meanings of kinship, but starts by thinking about the polysemic nature of the word abolish, or the trickiness of that word in this context, but insisting that it is the right one in the end. Abolish is a word that comprises destruction and negation, but also preservation, transformation, and actualization. So I compare the task of building, realizing, and proliferating the infrastructures of care in the world, predicated on our common need to be known, held, dare I say loved, with the task of building a world of real justice in the context of, the better known abolitionism of our present time, which concerns the criminal justice system. So I asked by analogy to Ruth Wilson Gilmore, what would it mean to not need the family? Because as prison and police abolitionists like Gilmore argue, abolition is not achieved when one burns down all the police stations and the prisons, although that element of destruction is certainly likely to be part of the process. Abolition is only achieved when the kernel of need on which the current infrastructure rests, namely, in that case, justice, when it has been taken up and made real for the first time in history, made real in the context of a world in which true justice prevails, the very idea of prison has become a strange, distant memory, or indeed unthinkable. So in that sense, one does not replace something which one wants to abolish, right? The family abolitionists, Michelle Barrett and Mary McIntosh, put this point really clearly. They did not want to put something in the place of the family. It makes no sense to replace a system of organized scarcity, even if it feels incredibly scary to imagine living in a society in which the ideological, juridical, and material container of biogenetic kinship is not present. It's super scary for many people to imagine the absence of the familial containers we use to sustain the illusion that our cared forness is not contingent on labor, the choice to care every day, that instead it is made automatic by nature, by God, or by the sanction of the state. But it can also be, especially for some of us, and I suppose that is a differentially distributed availability, pretty exciting, inspiring, and even a comforting thought to realize, that there is a long history of, refuge making for, refugees of the private house, the private nuclear household and the family. It can be kind of comforting to some people to realize that the very origin of the word feminism is bound up with the dream of non-familial life, right? This does not tend to be included on lists of sort of famous historic girl bosses, but family abolition and feminism is in a way, they were invented as one. This guy, Charles Fourier, kind of is behind the coining of the word feminism. He drew up blueprints for a post-work city that would, inspire large groups of people all over the world for the best part of 2 centuries to try and implement and develop his peculiar, kinky designs. It can be intensely affecting for some of us, by the same token, to recognize that family abolition, albeit marginalized within the history of communism, is in a sense orthodox Marxism. And it was seriously on the table for a moment when the dissident left Bolshevik Alexandra Kollontai, at the helm of the brand new revolutionary state, planned to socialize child rearing, even though she was immediately suppressed and the Soviet experiment became a disaster. Lenin said he was convinced in theory, but in practice he would prefer if the family was abolished much later on. 50 years after Kollontai's brief moment, her brief moment in real power, before which she served for another 50 years, surviving Stalin. There was Shulamith Firestone and her women's liberationist comrades theorizing the communization of care, the liberation of children, and the elimination of the sex distinction itself in New York. Gay liberation fronts, groups throughout North America, the UK, and Europe identified the family in the 70s as the cell of capitalism's social tissue and experimented with anti-patriarchal childcare collectives. And anti-imperialist and revolutionary Black feminists propagandized against the family as an elemental component of white supremacist state rule. Throughout the 70s and 80s, welfare radicals, disability liberationists, and militant housewives against housework and work as a whole sought together to explode the basis of, economic productivity on the one hand and or maternalist respectability on the other, on which the whole system of state support to proletarian households sort of rests ideologically. Fuck you, pay us, I believe, is the general gist. So it was these groups who insisted that the family really means, the family, because, as the philosopher Kathy Weeks has paraphrased, the model of the nuclear family that has served subordinated groups as a fence against the state, society, and capital is the very same white, settler, bourgeois, heterosexual, and patriarchal institution that was imposed by the state, society, and capital on the formerly enslaved indigenous peoples and waves of immigrants, all of whom continue to be at once in need of its meager protections and marginalized by its legacies and prescriptions. So, as such, it can be liberating to realize that Margaret Thatcher's statement, "There is no such thing as society, there are individual men and women and there are families," is correct, but only insofar as the family is the mechanism whereby the social is eaten away. This is Barrett and McIntosh's argument, right, in The Antisocial Family. They suggested in this book, which is from 1982, that politically the left can in fact resist capitalism's pressure on all of us to have our needs met exclusively in the private sphere, right, be that commercially or non-commercially, in ways directly or only indirectly mediated by the market, i.e. by our moms and wives, and Instagram life coaches, or via Instacart shoppers, professional cleaners, masseuses, therapists, and so on. Too many of our institutions reinscribe the naturalness and desirability of the private nuclear household, even as our novels, TV shows, movies, jokes, and memes evoke a kind of satirical common sense knowledge that families are disappointing, frustrating, annoying at best, and dramatically destructive at worst. States, for example, incentivize marriage and property ownership and typically recognize only 2 parents per child. Social work typically carries a racist bias towards bourgeois or aspirationally bourgeois familiality. And mental health care often departs from the unstated premise that smoothing out the functioning of a family is an intrinsically desirable outcome. I'm interested in asking, can we envisage instead, forms of care that incline towards the question, what would it mean to not need the family? I wrote down earlier when Simone asked what happens to the heart when no support is available. I mean, I paraphrase here, but this is in fact, I think, the same question that I'm fundamentally asking when I suggest in language I understand is difficult and provocative to all of us, abolish the family. Okay, thank you.
Sophie, thanks so much for that really rich overview. I am so thrilled to hear from the two of you in discussion. So I'll let you take it away, but let me know when you'd like to take some questions from the audience and we can let folks jump in.
Can you hear me, Sophie?
Yes.
Okay. How shall we begin? I would like to just note that your mark for additional commentary is a heart. And your bullet points are hearts, which I really loved and seemed perfect. And also, why didn't anyone ever think of this before? But so I do want to talk a little bit about the sentence maybe that you just paraphrased, which is what happens to the heart when no support is available. Because in some ways, I am struggling with exactly the same questions that Abolish the Family raises, albeit in a slightly different cultural context and in a critical context that I would call poetics rather than philosophy or sociology or anything like that. The question of the commons is one which in some ways motivates this project. The question of whether what has been commonly described as Black social life, or also sometimes as fugitivity or waywardness, can account for the various ways in which this amazing thing, which happens in your book, so often happens. That is, that those who opt for alternative forms of life outside the sanctioned care structures, or who simply refuse to even participate in the discourse and acknowledge the state of war that they are inevitably, forced to live in, that is all of us, right? End up alone without the structures of care and support that utopian visions of a reorganized revolutionary society would create. And thus, Shuli died alone in her apartment. And in a way, this is on your page 61, and in a way, it's exactly that ending that propels my struggle with what people, what the music writers call toxic masculinity in this music, because in a way, it seems to me there's a crux of truth in the exploration of the harms of patriarchy that seem to me to be creatively productive and interesting to look at.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate this this rich comment, which makes me kind of realize, so a couple of times that same sort of historic fact about, Firestone dying alone in her apartment, in fact, dying unnoticed, laying there long enough that she began to smell, is actually raised in this way to discredit the project. You're doing this very differently, and it's helped me see how, how dismissive and defensive I can sometimes be when it comes to figures like my problematic faves, like her. I mean, so to say something about her, wow, clearly she needed a family. It's not,
That's not
it's not,
yeah.
but no, exactly. Yeah, there is something to be said for the meditation on like things that are worse than family that are imaginable. I mean, that there is something that comes about when you start talking about this terrain, which instantly brings people's imagination to, the worst possible apocalyptic scenarios. We like to imagine as well. constantly in our, blockbuster type cinema, the very conditions that would make, family just utterly necessary, unquestioned. We love to make apocalyptic landscapes where the very kind of the pared down unit of the sort of settler family, like the father and the mother and the child, or perhaps the mother dies, or perhaps the father dies, or whatever. But there's a kind of pared down biogenetic unit that is what we imagine at the end of the world in a white supremacist bourgeois like art culture, I think.
Yeah, it's the Cormac McCarthy, the road culture.
Exactly, yeah. But sometimes when you kind of notice all of that stuff, it's easy to kind of forget to, to think through there are worse alternatives than the family, I think. I think that's true, I think people could be warehoused increasingly the way that certain kind of workers for Amazon in Eastern Europe are, dormitory warehousing, is an emergent form of social reproduction, I'm also constantly trying to be sufficiently agile to recognize that for many humans, inclusion in the human, inclusion in familiality, inclusion in it is so recent that that there can be a it's difficult to find a language in which to recognize the sort of the uneven distribution of the kind of the pain. I think you're also talking about braided with pleasure in the history of survival, survivance. Like, it's a complex thing that both both the sort of the demand for familial recognition and the rejection of family as a horizon is in sort of liberationist histories. For workers' struggles, it was a bit of a victory in Europe, talking about the kind of, labor victories that brought about state recognition of proletarian households and marriages. This was a sort of great advance, for certain kind of leftist platforms. At the same time, it threw all these kind of queer and sex working and colonized sorts of bodies under the bus. But we're still in that place of being like, we like, if you were to take away the family somehow, like, people would die en masse. It'd be a nightmare. There can be
yeah, some people would die en masse, but I guess, I mean, children, I want to put aside the question of like children and those who are unable to care for themselves, and sort of think about I mean, I'll tell us an anecdote that sort of like can bring our sort of positions, I think, closer together, which is that I was talking to my therapist, who we were having a conversation about certain kinds of gender roles and questions of coupledom and sort of common sense understandings of what it means to be married or something like that. And she said, oh, like, you don't really have, I said, I don't really know what you're talking about. And she said, oh, like, you don't have a way of understanding something like infidelity. And I said, I'm Black. And she said, we laughed, she's funny. And so but I meant that, like, I really meant it, that there is a way in which, and you detail this in your, as you said, what do you call it? The great title of your chapter, which is like a potted history, right, of abolitionism. You talk a lot, you give a clear summary of how it is that Black people, particularly who in post-slavery societies, really don't have the same sense of what it means to achieve bourgeois familiality or something like that, because there are retained aspects of exclusion from that form of the family that maybe will never, ever, in my expectation, will never go away, that there is always a certain amount of flux in familial relations among the Black people that I have known, and in my own understanding of what it means to know those norms. And so I guess in a way, when I say something like, oh, we want to avoid throwing folks under the bus who refuse the couple form, who refuse the family, and how can we think though about the networks of the existing networks, right? We're exactly on the same page. How can we think about the actual networks that would allow those who are not willing to sell themselves to those structures, right, to a certain degree? How can we increase them in number? Because they are actually so few and far between, in my experience, in the absence of movement, which is, I think, where we are now. Really isolated moment. So that, for example, like I'm not in a couple. I have a small child. I'm from a very like a kind of like upper middle class but non-bourgeois Black family. And I find myself often like cathected by various forms of family aggression, and I don't mean my own family, I mean various structural aggressions that are actually the way in which I have to negotiate all intimacy in my life, right? And yeah, I mean, so for me, it's non-theoretical, it's extremely practical, it's extremely present. It's very much a matter of day-to-day cultivation of ties that, yeah.
Yeah. Part of me wants to ask you a little bit about the sort of the figure of the protected child, the child in need of protection, and the sort of the shadow actually existing children, many of whom are explicitly not worthy of protection on the sort of biopolitical stage. I'm really thinking about how this kind of massive mobilization against I don't know if you would agree with me in sort of summarizing like this, but sort of bodily autonomy, really, as it manifests for gestators, pregnant people who want us to stop being pregnant for whatever reason or no reason, and children who or youth who want to be socially recognized as the sort of people they are in terms of gender, and the way that is braided together with the sort of book burning kind of anti-critical race theory sort of crusade in terms of public school curricula in this country. Because I do think that when there's a moral panic, and as we saw in the 80s, exactly the same things were said about children, and the contagiousness of gayness, as is being said now about transness, as though contagion or seduction were sort of in and of themselves bad things, or like ways that we somehow should do without as we identify what we want to be and become together. It's crazy to think that we could somehow not be that social forms are not catching, or or that you can sort of figure out your gender in a vacuum, without seeing someone like yourself. Amazing. on its face. But yeah, there is something I think also about the privatization of care at the core of all this. Sorry, to get to my point. Like when we see these kind of morbid symptoms, the sort of white nationalists doing cottagecore trad wifery on the one hand, and then the sort of liberal center having conniptions and convulsions about like exodus from heterosexuality and like heteropessimism, the implicit whiteness of heteropessimism as well in its forms, where I think Asa Sarrazin was quite aware of this really and said so, right? But it's been taken up in a weird way, that concept, like the national culture of complaining about men whilst doing absolutely nothing about it. You know what I mean? Like taking no pleasure in men, or doing nothing so that pleasure might become possible, or doing nothing to build a different norm, a different culture, a different way of life, but to sort of insist on this kind of almost like I want to say miserabilism, like a sort of thwarted desire, a kind of domestic realism of like, you know, I'm a mom, I do so much work, I do more emotional labor than my male sort of partner or whatever. This kind of this white national discourse that has emerged, I think, to save in a weird way, like the private nuclear household by imagining that if we were to equalize housework between men and women in the private nuclear household, that would be somehow enough, that would be all we would need to do, right? Sorry, I'm rambling, but
I'm laughing because I'm like, I don't know what white people do at home. Like, I don't. But I think I'm following what you're saying about. I mean, I guess I'm thinking first of all about. I want to say two things. One is that at the core of care, I do understand. I think you to be saying something like there is a kind of fallacy at the core of the idea of care, which rests on the image of the defenseless child or something like that. Is that correct? Am I understanding you correctly?
I think, yeah, more or less, I think you are getting me. Yeah, I mean, I think care is a perfectly good concept as long as we qualify it. Like care for what, of what, for why. You know, if you just say care, like I don't know what that is. It could be be care of the wrong things, the wrong social.
Yes, I see. I mean, I guess I want to say, I mean, the lawyer in me wants to say something like I want to distinguish between something like infancy and the infinite duration of childhood when we think about care as like an abstract term, which may in fact be indexed by babies. I don't know, you know, like in terms of like the inability of some humans to survive without a certain amount of support, right? Whether it's actual biological support that is being fed and this kind of thing and clothed and sheltered by someone else, or, you know, the variety of emotional labors that we have to do to sort of secure this, the intactness or something like that of a person with, you know, not to cause harm to them so that they shatter. And I guess, you know, I do recognize those things as separable, you know, and also having, you know, I've thought a great deal about how this sort of metaphorization or something of care that goes on in the domestic sphere, right? It's like, yes, I'm a mother and my son needs a lot of things and has since he was born, right? But there is a trajectory and those things change. I mean, so the actual care that he needs over the long term, like any human being, is like radically different from 6 months to the next. And so I totally agree with you that our sense of like is of what it is to care for someone probably needs some revision, and also just like better words or something, you know what I mean? Like we need to be able to describe better what we mean by caring for a person in the moment, right? Like in the moment. And I guess like I love your word, I think you use the word comradeliness. You're talking about friendship, I guess, often, but the sense of comradeliness does seem to be a better word than care, which because it's separable from this idea of infancy. Just thinking in a basic way about what care can be and how it can be exercised among autonomous individuals, right? Yeah.
Yeah, gosh, I realize now with embarrassment that I think I threw like 7 questions together into my last answer. The initial thought I had was about the really morbid fascination with specifically the fertility of the figure of the child, the endangered cissexual white child that is driving so much of the monstrous kind of anti-trans children bills that are going through at the moment. And there was so much work on this that I was only recently made aware of, and I critical childhood studies has been making links between the kind of the abolitionist kind of work to decriminalize sort of Black children and Black youth, and to even bring Black childhood into a place where it kind of means something comparable to the demands for care that can be made in the name of white cissexual fertile children in America, right? And can have demands for care kind of linked to them in the first place, because the trans panic is perhaps a reproductive panic, is part of a kind of need to there's a riddle here. But the links between the critical race theory panic and the sort of anti-abortion stuff and the trans child stuff, I think, has to do with the right to reproduction of a certain kind of nationhood via, and the perils of sort of, of damaged, fertility in the figure of the future of the nation, which is implicitly a white body, but which is why people permit themselves to, to think about children's genitals while calling, trans people pedophiles, or to indeed, have these sorts of contradictory ideas about parental authority and parents' rights as sacrosanct, whilst making really clear that it's only certain kinds of parents who will be treated that way. If a parent is affirming of a child's transness or comradely, then suddenly that parental authority goes out the window, right? Is non-existent anymore. Does not matter. In fact, proves a sort of
well, they become a danger.
Yeah, they become a danger. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Gosh. Okay.
Should we think about seeing if people have some questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
No, thank you so much for that really, really engaging discussion. I hope folks should be able now to text in the chat. And I think we're a small enough group that if anyone would like to just unmute themselves to ask a question, I think that would be okay. But otherwise, you can type something into the chat. Heather, you want to get in on this?
I would like to, yeah. Thank you guys so much. That was an amazing presentation and conversation. It was awesome. So much to think about, but I guess just because I work on specifically sort of queer LGBT issues, like I'm just kind of wanted to think a bit about that a lot of sort of anti-family thinking has come out of that context, of course. Lee Edelman, fuck Orphan Annie, and just alternatives to the family. But I guess just to speak for a second to like, someone that I'm very partial to your kind of invocation of pain and the pain of exclusion. So it seems clear to me that the whole gay marriage thing comes out of the long history of exclusion from the couple and the family, right? That's a kind of reaction formation. So I think we understand that, or we can understand that in that context. But I guess I was sort of specifically curious, and maybe this is more of a question for Sophie about the sort of, the kind of utopian thinking about queer kinship and why that choice of kinship. And, do we understand that as a kind of, as a kind of false consciousness, like why embrace the very thing that has been such a problem? And I guess maybe, this is maybe asking too much, but in a way, the sort of, I'm completely into the move from sort of kinship to comradeship. But, what do we, if we're thinking about it, as different ways to describe non-biological intimacies, let's say, what do we lose, or what do we fear losing in sort of changing what we call that, in a sense, right? Because I think, people are often using these terms to refer to, something they think of as sort of the same thing, right? And kinship is a way to say, like, no, we really mean it. Like, if you get sick, I'm going to take care of you, like that, that these are lifelong connections, right? People are using kinship to name certain kinds of intimacies. So it's a bit of a formless question, but I'm just, I just wanted to respond because I've thought a lot about these issues in a sort of queer context. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to try and not fangirl too much about you specifically posing this to me. you did paraphrase. I mean, I don't think I've had the pleasure of meeting you properly before,
No,
but
no, it's true. It's true.
What you just said is, bang on the money. What I have been kind of noodling when we use the metaphor of kinship, we are, in my opinion, as you said, I will take care of you when you're sick. The specificity of it is almost the idea that I have no choice but to do so, right? That's the promise. That's what feels good about it. If I say to you, you're kin, it's basically, this gets very kind of philosophically like infinite regression-y, I think, because I'm sort of saying to you, like, why would I need to say it if it were true? If there was some kind of automaticness to the caring for you when you get sick. Sorry, how to make this make sense, but I think so. We know that quote unquote real kin fail each other at best all the time, and at worst and very, very frequently harm and murder one another and rape one another. Nevertheless, it doesn't register as a horrible threat when an airline says, we're all family here. No, we don't go,
get off the plane right now.
So the metaphor, is about like, I think, I don't know, I trace links between it and the fantasies we have about automation. Like, nature and automation is actually part of this language. Like, I would not have the choice. I would not choose to get up every morning and make kinship, because the name has already made that choice for me. Something else, God, the state, the sanction of a marital union, or the sanction of a blood magic, and so that's very appealing, isn't it? It makes us feel safe. There's no mystery really. But when those utopian queer movements, and so many of them, so many have said the same thing, about kinship being something we make as we will. yeah, sure. Like, you know, it's a bit like my sort of thoughts about surrogacy, like yes and no, like how, like the original kinship is also made, actually. It just has managed to shore up so much legitimacy that we don't really think of it that way anymore. But kinship is always made, not given. So then where does that sort of really bring us when we make kinships with a hyphen, you know, chosen or queer, or actually we wouldn't put hyphens there, never mind, but you get what I mean. Like if queer kinship was really just as good as the real thing, then I wouldn't really have to say the queer part, would I? I don't know. If it was just, anyway, these are sorts of my like concerns about that. I'm with Donna Haraway in the 80s when she says, I'm sick to death of kinship metaphors. Actually, I think 90s. But then she sort of, you know, in the 21st century is just going, fuck it, you know, kin making all the way. And there's something really interesting about that turn. I do think it's a narrowing of political ambition. But I think I've said enough. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
I guess
Anyone?
Can I just add something? And it's very hard to articulate this. Hi, Heather. I guess what I want to say is something like in the effort to, I won't even use the word kinship or family or anything, in the effort to sort of reconstitute networks of support and love and intimacy. I like the word intimacy, actually, it's the word I prefer. The problem is that effort is under so many attacks that it is easier and in some ways preferable, you know, from an efficiency standpoint to make the sort of like hyphenated kinship move. And I get it. The problem is that I don't think that we have a whole lot of discourse around the ways in which there's pressure on the alternative networks that are outside the movement context. I guess this is the point I'm trying to make, that so that if in fact one lives in a situation where one is constantly reconstituting intimacies and literally building them up from scratch, right? There are going to be various instances where, and I mean, I'm speaking as if this is abstract. It isn't. I do it every day. You know, like, you know, there's going to be, you know, a baby daddy who's going to be able to interrupt, right, every effort that you make in order to reconstitute the parental or, you know, or you know, sort of raising effort that's being made by a variety of mothers, right? Every single time there's going to be that interruption, that intervention, and there's going to be state support of it. And we could use almost any example of intimacy or care with a coupled system of attack on it. And so, I mean, we've got a problem, and I do think that I don't know how to solve it, but it's the exposure that is sort of like the exposure that's my current sort of area of concern.
Right. Thank you.
Are there any other questions from folks in the audience? I have a slightly off-topic question, but just listening to the two of you today, I was thinking about how both of you have made like some of your most exciting, but also like perhaps most accessible interventions through like other aesthetic means. Like Simone, you're talking about what teachings might be held in trap music, and Sophie, I've like really enjoyed reading so much of your cultural analysis and film reviews. And so I'm wondering if there's anything that either of you are watching or listening to that's informing your work right now, or that captures something that you're interested in related to these topics we've been hearing about today.
Well, if you don't mind me going first, Simone, I guess I will say for my sins, I do have a fascination with the romance reality genre, or the reality romance genre, things like Love Island, Love is Blind, the huge proliferation, which, you know, I do want to, you know, there's never been a TV show I don't want to do a sort of Marxist feminist analysis on, but like, what is it about Love Island, for instance, the UK show, that you know, intrigues me so much? I think maybe it just, maybe I don't need to rationalize. In fact, probably I shouldn't, but there is something about the way at the end of each season of this show, a plastic baby robot, I kid you not, gets brought out, and every heterosexual couple has to parent this baby for a day. It will cry, and you have to kind of like shake it when it cries, and and you get rated for your prowess as a parental couple at the end, based on the robots, you know, and the baby sometimes does get thrown in the pool, you know, that there are moments of real, but so this whole kind of like pageant of like, there are so many of them. Everywhere you look, there's a show that's about finding Mr. or Mrs. Right, Mr. or Miss Right, even getting engaged to them on TV, you know, within days of meeting them, which kind of seems to increasingly desperately say, like, you know, we want the family, we want marriage and a baby and a family and private property. That is what we want, right? We do, right? We definitely want that, right? And this baby thing at the end is almost like a kind of, it makes me think that the whole operation is designed to kind of make you think, right, nothing could be worse than the Love Island villa. Literally, this parody of communal life. That's the secret to it. Sorry, you really kind of opened the can of worms here, Maria. I have a million opinions about this. So like, you think you're looking at a rehearsal of marriage and domesticity, but actually you're looking at 12 people bored out of their minds after 8 weeks of 24/7 scrutiny, that in a sort of in a faux collective situation, a pseudo commune. So what are they doing? They're fleeing into domesticity and marriage. You have to create a situation that horrifying to make this kind of baby thing tolerable. That's why it's the final challenge. Like, please, anything at all, other than this kind of collectivized experience of social reproduction. That's my best kind of. I think we're looking in our millions at these shows to sort of maybe almost squint and see if there's other ways of doing life. Like, is marriage and the couple forum really the only available option, or are there kinds of lines of flight that we can detect, you know, alternatives that we might be able to glean a glimpse of? Because at the same time, on the next channel, or the next like play, you know, the thing next up is the Cult Psychology Survivor documentary, which is a very different vision of social reproduction, which also appeals to us. We also think we could get sort of seduced into cults very easily because of our desire, I think, which is quasi-universal, for belonging and being known and having everything taken care of for you in a sort of community togetherness kind of spirit, right? So we have these two very different things, the kind of like reality romance couple forum generating shows and the sort of cult shows. And I think we basically have the same relation to both. We're like, which is more likely to get us, you know, a spouse or a cult guru? Because we actually know the answer to that statistically. We know perfectly well who actually causes harm like on a statistically significant scale, right? It's family members, it's spouses, it's your boyfriend, you know. But instead we kind of pretend that it's like a predatory kind of groomer, you know, such as the drag queen reading to your child in a public library, or you know, perhaps the cult figures we love to make TV about. Okay, I'm going to shut up now.
I don't know. I think the thing that I've been most interested in lately is actually clothes. And I don't have any, like, I mean, I'm always sort of working, I'm continuing to write about some, you know, the tail ends of the sort of gender, sexuality, hip hop stuff. But I've been super interested. I have a renewed interest in clothing and like luxury clothing in particular. I've always been sort of interested, but I've renewed interest in it, and partly I don't know what has happened. I think, I sort of it loses my attention because nothing interesting happens, and then some designer will come with something really incredible. And lately, guess what it is? You'll laugh. It's been it's been the new Celine line is and what Celine is doing with Carhartt, which does have to do with all this gender. My interest in sort of like genderless clothing, I guess. Anyway, I'm super interested in it, and in particular, the leather ones. But I would never write about this. I would never write about this. It's just a joy.
Listen, being a freelance writer is weird sometimes. You're not always choosing what you write about. It's the great luxury and joy is to have some sense that you're writing what you think needs to be said. But I wondered if you had an opinion on the Rihanna outfit at the Super Bowl halftime show, because I did a stupid tweet about it because I thought that the outfit was saying what I looked at the discourse and people were all saying when she beamed down, it was saying, is this feminism or is this pregnancy? Those were the two options.
Oh, really?
Based on how before it came out that the answer was pregnancy, although you could ask why not both. But the way she was covered from neck to toe and indeed to fingertip, and I in the end I said yes when an editor asked me to analyze that in terms of.
Oh, really? Are you writing about Rihanna's outfit? That's so interesting.
Well, I won't turn down the money, but I wondered if you had a take, because there was this way she was swaddling herself in these kind of labial waves of crimson that made me kind of feel that there was a sort of gestational power.
I'm choosing to look away from Rihanna at this moment.
One day I will have the luxury of doing so too.
There's too much going on. The performative baby making is a lot.
Mm-hmm. Oh, agreed. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just because we're out of time, I guess this is the note we're wrapping up on. So I apologize / you're welcome for bringing us in this
afternoon kind of
I know.
You asked.
I did ask. Yeah. So I take responsibility for this. But I just wanted to thank you both so much for sharing your work with us. We're just really grateful to have you in the GSWS community, and that you took some time to talk with us today. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for
asking.
Everyone. It was very fun. Bye.
Great fun. Bye, everyone.